Now here for our first task, we want to talk about the transfer and seizure of our operations master roles. But before we get into the actions you would accomplish to do either of those tasks, I think it's important for us to spend just a couple of minutes looking at the operations master roles itself. Now we've already gone through this content back in the 70-410 course that I put together for Pluralsight. And so what I want to do is tee up a very short clip from that 70-410 content, so you don't have to click back through to the Pluralsight interface to find it, where we talk a bit about what the operations master roles are, what they're used for, and some of the gotchas that are associated. If you have already taken a look at this, if you already went through that 70-410 content with me back in that other Pluralsight course, well, feel free to click the fast forward button and we'll dig right into the transfer and seizure of those FSMO roles. Microsoft, in attempting to create a multi-master model for the Active Directory database, one where every copy of the database was exactly the same and there was no single master where everyone pulled their content from, realized that a small subset of the activities of Active Directory could not be made multi-master. Some of these things worked best, or worked at all, when a single computer was responsible for the execution of that task. These created what we now know of as the FSMO roles. These 5 FSMO roles define a set of activities that have to occur on a specific machine. The first of which is the schema master. Anytime you do any update to the Active Directory schema, not necessarily changing content in the database, but changing the structure of the database itself. Updates like the AD prep command, Microsoft Exchange's updates, any other applications that are going to modify the Active Directory schema, those changes have to happen on the domain controller server that has been configured as the schema master. There's only one per forest, and generally that schema master is placed on the forest root PDC. And hold on to that, we'll get to the PDC emulator here in a minute, but that schema master is generally placed on the PDC emulator role holder in the forest root domain. Most important thing to know here is that in order to do any changes to the schema, you have to have a schema master up and operational. We have another role here called the domain naming master, which is responsible for, you guessed it, naming of domains. This role is what's responsible for adding and removing domains and application partitions from the Active Directory forest, and has to be online anytime you're doing any of those adds or removes to domains or app partitions. As with the schema master, the domain naming master is generally placed on that forest root PDC, which is our third role. Back in the old days, before we had a multi-master model for Active Directory, we used to have an approach where we had a single machine that served as the primary domain controller, and we had all other machines serving as secondary domain controllers or backup domain controllers, BDCs. These BDCs grabbed their content from the PDC, where the single master authoritative copy of the content always existed. All changes occurred at the PDC. Well, with that change to a multi-master replication model for our Active Directory database, it still made sense for some of the actions, some of the tasks, to occur on a single specified machine. That machine today is known as the PDC emulator. The PDC emulator handles password changes. So if you're doing computer user accounts on DCs, it handles the password changes. It's consulted by your replica domain controllers when you have service authorization requests with mismatched passwords. It is the default target DC anytime you're doing any group policy updates. It is also the default target DC when you have any legacy applications that need to perform writable operations. And some of the old school admin tools still point to the PDC emulators, the very old school admin tools, in order to accomplish their tasks. And also, not listed here, the PDC emulator tends to also be the timekeeper for the domain and forest. Your PDC emulator, because of obviously these things, needs to be online and accessible at all times. And so you generally can't operate for a very long period of time without having a PDC emulator up and running. Many of the other FSMO roles can exist in a state where that domain controller is down for a period of time. I mean, you don't often do schema changes. You don't often add and remove domains from your forest. But because of these things that the PDC emulator does, it's generally expected to be online and accessible at all times. And is generally also placed on higher performance hardware in a reliable hub site alongside other domain controllers that can handle your everyday user authentication traffic when you're in a very large organization where the emulator is doing a lot of tasks for a very large number of users and computers. Of the 5, the PDC emulator is perhaps the most important to keep up and operational. Now, the fourth of these is the RID master, and it's the job of the RID master to create what are called relative IDs for the different objects that require permissions or whatnot to be associated with them. A RID is a string of characters that is used to uniquely identify an object in a domain. The SID, which you're probably more familiar with, is just simply the RID plus an additional series of characters that is its domain identifier. So SID equals RID plus domain ID. The RID master's got to be online so that any newly promoted DCs can obtain a local RID pool. Generally, the RIDs are distributed by the individual DCs, and only when they run out of RIDs in their pool do they request another set of them from the RID master. And it generally is also placed on the forest root PDC. As you can see here, that PDC has got a lot of different roles that are generally held on it. Again, the RID master is not quite as important as the PDC emulator because its job is to maintain the pools that it distributes out to the domain controllers for actually assigning out those RIDs to individual objects. So you can have it shut down for a period of time, but you tend not to want to keep these things down for very long. The last of these is the infrastructure master, and its job is to update references in the local domain for many objects that exist in other domains, so these cross-domain references. You've seen this if you have a domain where your domain trusts another domain, either inside of a forest or outside through some forest trust. If you've had that situation where instead of seeing a username, you've seen a long list of numbers in the permissions dialog box when you're trying to assign permissions, it's the job of the infrastructure master to translate that SID into a friendly name so you actually know what you're looking at. It's also the job of the infrastructure master to manage any phantoms or tombstones out of the global catalog. And these are kind of advanced topics that have to do with how objects get deleted and preserved and potentially resurrected. But recognize that it's the infrastructure master's job just to maintain those cross-domain references. Now, a separate infrastructure master is created for each application partition, including the default forest-wide and domain-wide partitions. So it's possible you may see more than one infrastructure master in your domain, depending on if you've created additional app partitions. And that's an extremely advanced topic we'll leave for another day. But these 5 FSMO roles are those that you should be aware of probably for the exam, but more importantly for the implementation in your own Active Directory domain and forest. Because by default, all 5 roles will get held by the very first machine to come online. And so it may become necessary for you to transfer those roles to different machines should you have an outage event or should you need to just distribute the load. Now, my last slide here is one that used to be an awesome test question because it was one of those really ridiculous if-then statements having to do with the infrastructure master and its positioning. But who knows these days if Microsoft still cares. The infrastructure master was a bit of an odd duck in with the other FSMO roles because of how it needed to be placed. So this is that if-then statement that, again, I present to you because it's been just one of those wacky ones in the past, and who knows if it's still necessary today. In a single domain forest, so you have a single domain, single forest, the infrastructure master can be placed on any domain controller. This is the case because the infrastructure master in a single domain forest that doesn't have any connections or other domains to deal with, it doesn't have that much to do. However, in a multi-domain forest, the infrastructure master is generally placed on a domain controller that is not a global catalog, and in fact shouldn't be placed on a DC that's not a GC, except in the case where all of the DCs are global catalogs. And in that case, it just doesn't matter. So again, I present this to you because those are the rules, and this one is a little bit wacky in comparison with the other ones. But in reality, whether or not it's important for the exam, this is one thing you might take a look at in your own domain to make sure that you've got your infrastructure master placed in the appropriate location.